Before we start this podcast, we just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Amphibipod, who now sponsor the show. Keep listening to hear this week's exclusive discount code for all your 3D printed reptile needs. Hey guys, this is episode 8 of the Herping Hour podcast, Leo Lowdown part 3. We'll be chatting to JTB Reptiles this week surrounding the Cohab and Conundrum. What JTB's managed to do is successfully cohab 3 Leos, a 1 to 2 female pair. So what I'm going to do is we'll let him introduce himself, what he's all about, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty of it.
My name's Joseph and I have a YouTube channel called JTB Reptiles. And what I basically focus on is heating and lighting first and foremost. So talking about different wavelengths and their interactions with reptiles and how we can practically use this information for keeping these animals, trying to improve their welfare by replicating sunlight. But I don't just talk about that. That's sort of a thing in the past year or two that I've really gotten into. I also talk about occasionally natural history and taxonomy, which is sort of a lot of what I do outside of reptile keeping, as well as other things like bioactivity and enclosure design and so on and so forth. I've been keeping reptiles for 7.5 years, thereabouts. I keep a range of things, so your commonplace stuff, corn snakes, leopard geckos, and so on. But I also keep some things which are a little bit more out there, like line day geckos. Until recently, I did have a couple of twin spot rat snakes, dart frogs, collared lizards, a western green lizard. So I keep a nice mix of things, but that's basically me.
I love the fact that you push on your channel the scientific side of stuff, which is why you're the perfect person to come on and talk about this topic, because you're not just doing it for the sake of being like some people will do it and put them in small vivs all together because they want more, they want to cram them in, they put them in there because they want to breed, but you know they're not too sure or confident enough to keep them separate, pair them separately. They don't want to use up more space by keeping them separate. You're doing it because it's been found that they live in loose colonies in the wild, but you've actually given them the space and the heating and lighting elements to be able to naturally adapt as a group, but obviously in a captive setting. What got you into reptile keeping?
Well, to be honest, I don't really know. It's just that it's one of them where, I suppose it's a bit cliche to say you're born with it, it's innate or whatever, but I think it really was, to be honest. I mean, some of me earliest memories, or one of the earliest memories I've got, is coming home from nursery at lunchtime and sitting down on this little cream sort of faux leather seat that we had with a tuna butty, watching Steve Irwin's Crocodile Hunter Diaries. And I was always dead into dinosaurs when I was little, and then obviously sort of because dinosaurs are always portrayed as being like reptiles, and it sort of stemmed from that, and it's never left me.
Have you ever sat there and seen anything on TV and thought, right, I love that. That's what I eventually one day want to keep? Have you got anything, your all-time favourite reptile or anything? Or has it always been just you love everything about it because of Steve Irwin?
Well, no, I've always been more of a lizard person than anything else, which is sort of weird because most people are either everything or snake people.
Yeah,
but,
that is true, yeah.
But I'm sort of a lizard person, I would think. But in terms of favourite species, I never want to say I've got a favourite species, because until you've kept it, you've only seen a picture of it or a video of it, and everything's always different when it's there in the flesh. But my absolute favourite group that I've at least worked with is lacertids. So for anybody who's familiar with going on holiday abroad in Europe, the little green things and brown things that run about on walls, I've always really liked them, but I've actually got one to keep, and they're not the most intelligent things, I would say. They're just sort of intensely greedy, but the way they move and the way they act, you can understand it. You come in the room, and if they think they're going to be fed the head's cocked on one side with one eye looking at you, and they're running over and they'll chase your hands, and they're just good fun and pretty as well. Not good for beginners, really, because if you don't get the lighting spot on, they're not going to do well, but good fun.
Yeah, because obviously their climate's a lot different to ours. I personally don't think any reptile is a beginner species, because they've all got quite complex care, whether it's the supplement routine, the feeding routine, obviously the lighting and stuff, because everyone thinks the ways of old is all right, heat mats, throw them in the corner, they're fine. Whereas I do understand all heating elements have their places. Things have advanced a lot since heat mats were the all big in thing. With you having more exotic species, what got you into Leos and stuff, and or have you always had just the natural interest in it? Did you see one and just think, I need one of them? Or
Well, to be honest, leopard geckos, the first reptile I had was a leopard gecko. And aside from a 2-week stint between losing the first leopard gecko and getting another one, I've always had them for nearly 7.5 years. I've always had a leopard gecko, and the reason I got the first one is I would have been 12 at the time, 24. In fact, no, I would have been 11. April 2014 when I got the first one, because I'd wanted a Pac-Man frog, but I couldn't get one anywhere. But a leopard gecko was available, and as everybody said online, oh, these are easy to keep. So I got one of them. People said bearded dragons as well, but they seemed I didn't have the space. Or funnily enough, at the time, the thought occurred to me, bearded dragons, it looks like they need a load of lighting. I don't want to get into that. So I got a leopard gecko and I just had the heat mat on it. Having kept them for some time, I've sort of grown more and more fond of them as being quite intelligent animals. I would certainly say out of all the reptiles I keep, or indeed have kept, I think the leopard geckos are the most intelligent. Out of all the herps I've kept, it's the dart frogs. The dart frogs are the most clever. Nobody believes me when I say that, but I think they are. If you pay enough attention to animals, then you sort of get to know them. And leopard geckos are really one of those, I feel, because they aren't running about or jumping around. It's easy to see them as being quite slow and dim-witted animals, but when you just give them the time to behave as they choose to, and you give them the opportunity to behave, so they're not just in a bare bones setup, they have space and they have things to climb on, they have things to do. They've really shown me that they are quite intelligent, and so for that reason, I do really enjoy owning them.
I think that's what interests me about them as well, because people tend to project intelligence in a different form and not understand they've got to dance. Everything is a dance with the Leo, so they've got the whole tail movements, the way they walk, everything is so intricate and suited to that species. They're not daft in regards to that. They'll go out everywhere all day and whatnot. They will explore and everything, but they know I'm going to make a nice burrow here in a cave or whatever, and they'll take that opportunity and they'll have the loose colonies. Everything is very scripted with them, and they know exactly what they're doing. So if a male comes across a female, she's got to accept that male, otherwise there's going to be a fight. And I don't think people get that. I think people just think that they're very primitive and it's, they'll mate and that's it constantly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what that is. What's interesting about the species, they have a very intricate dance with everything. Everything has to be on both terms, not just one's terms. Because I know in dragon species, some males will just go straight in there and grab and try, but I've only ever seen one male try it, like thinking he was the king ding, and the female just turned around and she whooped him. She was like, I'm not having it, not today. Not happening.
Go back home.
Yeah, I think that's what is interesting. You're right, they are a very intelligent species. I think a lot of people just see them as, you're right, a dopey little plodding along sort of thing. They do like to explore and stuff, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying they don't, and they will. You give them space, every inch of it.
As you say with them, people just sort of look at things. I often think in terms of intelligence, people look at an animal, and if the way it behaves resembles something they're familiar with, they think it's more intelligent. So I said the Lacertas, I don't think they're as clever as the leopard geckos, but they're more recognisably intelligent. So, as I say, they cock their heads on the side, they run over and have a look. It's like a puppy dog, the way they behave.
Yes. Whereas
leopard geckos sit there and just look half asleep. You think, no contest, Lacerta's cleverer every time, but the leopard geckos pick up on things, The leopard geckos never, when they're in food mode and something's moving, they'll grab. But they don't, if I put my hand in the enclosure, they come and have a look what it is and think about it. Whereas if I did that with the Lacerta, it'd just bite my fingers because it's excited and thinks there's food. And that's the thing with leopard geckos, really. They're quite this is all entirely subjective. Nobody's done like some game show with leopard geckos contested against other reptiles to test how clever they are, but they seem very, very methodical, and I like them for that.
Yeah. Is there anything else that interests you about them, like other than obviously their intelligence behind them? Any morphs or anything?
Well, I'm not really into morphs. I tried to my group, they're all max snows apart from one which is a max snow hypo, and the only reason the morphs at all is that I couldn't find normals. Because I just wanted to stay away from any chance of genetic issues. But as it's happened, the two babies I've had from them this year, one is a max super snow, so I got the most intricate morph I possibly could from the pairing, and the other one I can't even tell what it is because it's almost pure white apart from some black splodges. So God knows what it is.
I'm really bad at genetics, and I think what interests you the most, Stace, is the genetic side. Like I could literally throw any picture at Stace and she'll look at it and she'll work, like from her understanding, she'll work out what that morph is. So when I say to her, if I put this with this, what would I get? She'd then break it down into the hets and everything, the percentages. She loves that. That's what interests her. That's what she loves about Leos. I don't have a clue about all that. To me, it's a Leo. And
Neither do I.
I love them for being Stacey's is very behind the science of it and the breeding formulations and stuff, aren't you, Stace?
I suppose we'll get to this with the breeding, but I had the adults in the 3x2x2 enclosure, which I moved them out of. And I got about half a dozen clutches from them this year, which I collected and incubated. Couldn't get any of them to hatch, wouldn't develop, last a couple of weeks. But I saw one clutch of eggs being laid in the enclosure. And because I'd been having such bad luck trying to incubate them artificially, I thought, oh, just sod it. They're in an awkward place. I'll leave them. And then I plan on moving the adults out. When the adults are moved, if the eggs are still there, I'll dig them up and try. So I'm not like upsetting them, changing the setup. But anyway, 48 hours after the adults had been moved from the old 3x2x2 enclosure was when I spotted a baby leopard gecko running around in there.
Aww.
So they just incubated in the enclosure on their own. So because it's there's lots and lots of decoration in there and it's all bioactive and that, I don't see them out. All I do is I've been putting food in a dish and it disappears.
Yeah.
And I did get a glimpse of one the other day out, and it's doubled in size in a couple of weeks. So they're doing all right, but I don't see them much.
When Stacey has her hatchlings, when they first come out and these dinky little things, and then when I look at them again, because she deals with all the Leos and the breeding side of that, and I'm like, how has that grown from that to that? And then the colour change as well. It's crazy how the colour changes within a matter of weeks from looking like a little splodge to this intricate pattern on them. It's amazing. Yeah. So you just mentioned then that the babies are being kept. Have you put the adults in a bioactive as well? Have you moved from one bioactive?
Yeah, they are.
Have you noticed? Have you always kept them bioactive, or did you have obviously naturalistic to begin with?
Well, over the years, the way I've kept leopard geckos has just changed completely. The first one I had was in an Exoterra faunarium with paper towel, plastic plants, and a heat mat underneath. No thermostat. That was it. And I kept her like that for a couple of months, but just in a couple of months, I decided that wasn't big enough. So then she went into a 2 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot or something viv with a ceramic heat emitter, lino on the bottom, plastic plants. And so, this is back in 2014. This is the start of my reptile keeping days. And she stayed in that for 2 years, I think. But after that 2 years was when, for the first time, I was sort of hearing about UVB. But at the time, I didn't understand it properly, saw it as sort of newfangled technology, didn't really want to go near it. So I got a glass Exoterra enclosure and put a heat mat on the bottom with the idea that I could just sit like a canopy on top with a compact light in it if I decided to go down the UV route. I thought it'll be an easy change to make. So she was in that, and that was still all artificial plants. I think it had one of those Exoterra sand mat things in it. And a little LED on top just so I could see in. And once I moved her into that, she didn't live for very long. She ate a few things and then didn't. She just stopped eating. Yeah. And then after several months of not eating, because what I did was I then stopped with the heat mat and put a ceramic on instead. And that made her go really, really active. So she was walking around everywhere, and I thought, oh, great, she might start eating again soon. Then I don't know what it was, but she just lost all her energy and in 24 hours died. That was my first reptile. She died 31st of January 2017. Looking back at it, I think the ultimate reason she died was probably on that glass Exoterra enclosure before the ceramic had been a heat mat that was thermostatically controlled to control basically a probe that was taped to the bottom of the enclosure at 30 degrees. So basically, the product of that is there's a sheet of glass that is the base of the enclosure, which is being heated to 30 degrees. And because it's well ventilated, everything else is room temperature. And there's no radiation, there's no infrared or visible light warming the animal. It's just got to sit on a 30-degree piece of glass to warm up. And obviously that isn't sufficient. So I think that change is probably the reason why she died. Although at the time I thought that I was doing my best for her. That's all I ever thought. I was reading all the care sheets and trying to do what they said, but they were wrong, basically. But sort of pushing on from that, I got another leopard gecko on the 12th of February 2017. I've still got, that's my male. And he started off in a basic quarantine setup. And then he went into the first bioactive one I'd done. And so I never really went naturalistic then bio. I just sort of went sterile bio in just one jump. Yeah, exactly. Now, would I say that naturalistic and bioactive are really different? Well, obviously, I never actually did just naturalistic, but although I have in the past, I don't really buy into bioactive anymore. I don't think that throwing some invertebrates into a substrate makes an enclosure much better or at all better. Now, some people are going to argue with me that just throwing some things into the substrate is not bioactive. You've got to give it months, you've got to let it settle, you've got to get all the mycorrhizal hyphae and all the fungi and things and beneficial bacteria in the substrate, blah, 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 blah. But I don't buy it. I don't believe that there is any good evidence that is necessarily going to improve the life of the animal. I think that naturalistic it's all of the way there, really. There's stuff for the animals to dig and climb. That's the trick, really. All that bioactivity does, and why I still maintain my enclosures as bioactive, is it allows you to provide naturalistic settings without having to worry so much about cleaning it. If you've got a large enclosure that's just naturalistic, great, but then cleaning it's going to be a pain in the neck. So if you've got some springtails that do the job for you for the most part and you just spot clean, well, job's a good one. Yeah. That's all I see it as.
I think on our last podcast, it was the bioactive Buddha one, and it was mentioned, do you judge, like, to the person who does the bioactive, you judge people for not a bioactive, and it was brought up versus naturalistic and stuff, and we were like, no, you shouldn't be, because naturalistic is just as good. As long as you're not keeping that animal bare minimum to suit yourself, and you are trying and you're learning and you're adapting, then no, bioactive is just the bonus, because it also, if that's your only reptile and you've got it as like a centerpiece, it looks nice for the human as well as obviously good for the reptile. But if it's naturalistic and you don't want to put it in, that's also a good centerpiece. So I agree with you on your sentiments on that, because I think too much judgment's put in about bioactive and stuff in some groups and whatnot, because some people are really pushing, you're not giving your animal the best unless it is bioactive, when if someone's completely naturalistic but they have all the enrichment needs in there, they've got all the hides, the hidey holes, the climbing, as you said, obviously ample opportunities to feed and stuff, then no, I think that is just as good as well. So yeah, I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, I think one thing I will say though is that perhaps there are some benefits to bioactive. So hunting the invertebrates is a potential one. I have seen that. I have seen one of my leopard geckos sniffing out and digging up a mealworm pupa and eating it, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah, so it's like that sort of enrichment side's good. Plus there is the side that if you've got a territorial animal and it's bioactive, so you're not changing out the substrate regularly, well, you're keeping all the scents intact.
Yeah.
And for some species that might really matter. But again, it's not some magic trick like you go bioactive and the thing's going to live twice as long. I don't believe any of that.
No.
Oh god, yeah.
Although the difference between naturalistic / bioactive and sterile, I think, is a big one. Just one sort of anecdotal thing, again, anecdotal, not studies, but something that I've noticed is in terms of the sort of behavioural adaptability of the animals. So my male leopard gecko, whose first bioactive enclosure was quite small, 2 foot by 1.5 foot by 1 foot tall, didn't have much in the way of climbing space, and obviously didn't have many hides just due to the size of it. But then when I moved him into a 3 by 2 by 2 foot, he sort of used it a bit, but again, it was all on one level until I made a big cut background for it. And he never used that for maybe 6 months, never went up it, never saw him use it. I don't know why. Was he nervous of it? Did he not have the strength to climb? But then all of a sudden he did use it. He sort of figured it out. And then at a later date, I put in some sticks, branches and things to increase the climbing space. And he couldn't climb. I assumed he would never be able to. I thought these twigs are way too thin. A leopard gecko can't climb on that. It's not a cresty. It's not going to stick to him. But after another 6 months, he was climbing on those branches. It's whether it's the muscle tone or just the technique or the confidence built up to the point where he could do it. And whether that matters for the animal's long-term health or not, I can't comment. But equally, does it matter? I've given that animal that's in my care something to do. And it's clear that it's gone from not being able to do it to being able to do it. And, surely that's something we should be aiming for.
My view on that is it beneficial to their health? And I would say, yeah, because far too often do we see chunky animals being classed as cute. And obviously people don't realise that there is a real danger with having your reptile overweight. You're slowly crushing their organs. If you're given that space to climb and all that enrichment to move about like that, you're then in turn exercising that animal without the potential of stressing them and constantly grabbing them and having them out all the time. Because obviously the more space they have, whether it's climbing or not, the more they're burning off. And I think it's always going to be beneficial to have your animal more active, whether it be climbing or just floor space, to have them move about more and instead of just in a little box just constantly feeding them. Because I think people's feeding routines, they're worried they're starving their animal because they see so many chunky animals and theirs aren't necessarily underweight but a nice healthy weight, and they compare their animal to these big ones they're seeing. It's like dragons. They're notoriously getting health issues, especially females, in the way of eggs and stuff. So for example, females get an egg folliculitis because A, they're being fed too much protein, and B, they aren't getting the exercise. They're too big, and obviously they can't produce eggs and lay them properly, and in turn poisoning themselves. So yeah, I'm going to say on that front that giving them floor space and the opportunity to climb, even if it takes a while for them to work it out or build up the strength, like you said, it's always going to be beneficial. And that isn't peer reviewed or anything. That's just my 2 cents on the topic.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of your stuff is, if not most of it, all of it is peer reviewed, isn't it? So all your scientific work is obviously
all of the sort of major stuff where I'm saying things where, if I've got this wrong, that would matter if somebody were to copy it. All of that's peer reviewed. Other ones which are peer reviewed, at the very start of the video, there's a 5-second logo demonstrating that it's been peer reviewed. So the video I've made, the 20-minute video on Leopard Gecko Cohabit, that is a peer reviewed video.
Yeah. So obviously it's not just you who's got the standpoints and the knowledge behind it. It's the other people you showed it to, because they'd obviously correct you and make you remove certain things if it wasn't scientifically factual.
Yeah, and we do that. And whenever there's something that somebody disagrees with, it gets written down. And if it's a serious disagreeing thing, then I can't put the badge on. I've got to change the video or do without it. But I always go in for changing. The comments I get on that are brilliant. If anyone's listening and is thinking of sending in for peer review, then beware that it will take time. You can't rush perfection, but it's worth your time, because the video product at the end is always much better.
So I think that's why your input is important in topics like this and lighting and stuff, because it's not just your say so. You don't see yourself as a breeder. I don't see you as a keeper. I see you as more than that, because you don't go, right, oh, I'll have this as a pet. From your videos, you're constantly trying to push the standards, not only for your animals, but for everybody else's as well. And whatever you learn and whatever you know, you're putting out there on your channel. So you're very, like, I'd consider your YouTube channel successful. Like, you might not be in the millions of subscribers, but you're hitting the people it needs to with the right information. And that's what matters.
I think the trick with it really is it's not this is right, this is wrong. I mean, okay, to be fair, there's some things which are damn well wrong, but it's about understanding. You know, if you understand what it is you're saying and what you're doing, you don't learn a list of answers like you put this here, you put it like that, you buy one of these, you don't buy one of these, this will end in failure, this will end in success. It's, I understand what I am doing. So if somebody throws this curveball at me, I'll give an answer which explains why it's wrong. Whereas, you know, in the past, when I was getting into reptile keeping and so on, it was just rote learn answers. You don't keep a Leo on sand because it'll get impacted.
Yeah.
You don't give it UV because it'll go blind. It's just never mind understanding what's going on. It's just these are the answers that you read from Mr. So-and-so's care sheet, and therefore it must be true.
Yeah.
You know, if you actually understand what you're doing, you don't have a list of answers anymore. You just understand.
Very true that. A lot of people need it explained to them in a manner that they're going to get. Whereas I find a lot of the reptile lighting, if somebody doesn't like reptile lighting and the other advanced groups, someone doesn't understand something, you can say that, because these people know what they're talking about. They're not just passing on secondhand information. And I think that's what makes the difference in the hobby, is actually knowing what you're talking about, as opposed to passing on the secondhand info.
Mm-hmm.
So what made you decide to cohab? Was it the studies that you'd seen previously, saying like they live in the loose colonies and stuff?
Well, it was a couple of things, really. Firstly, I sort of had a vague idea that I would like to try breeding, because I'd sort of not really had a proper breeding project. And, you know, potentially at some point in the future, whether I end up having a career in reptiles and conservation and so on, you know, that's sort of what I thought I'd do for a long time. I'm not certain what I'll end up doing. But if I am going to end up doing that, I would like to make the mistakes now with pet leopard geckos than with the last members of the species. And then the mistakes matter. So, you know, get into it and have practice and sort of know the feel of things. I thought that's sort of a good thing to do. And then additionally, was this sort of idea creeping into my mind that leopard geckos are naturally, at least loosely, social animals. You know, there's no, well, I won't say it because it's biology, and biology always throws up oddities, but there's no animal on planet Earth which spends its entire life in solitude. So is it right that we keep them for their entire lives in solitude? Maybe, maybe not. I'm just going to give that question out there and let people think about it. But certainly in any case, allowing an animal to breed, even if, you know, you only do it every couple of years and you only ever freeze the eggs or just chuck them out, that's enrichment.
Yeah. Yeah, actually. Yeah.
You know, it's giving them something to do, and the females then got to go and lay those eggs and hide them. And as long as they're kept in good health, it's given them something both physically and mentally to do.
Yeah.
And again, for an animal like a leopard gecko, which is at least loosely social in the wild, it becomes more important that we give them that opportunity to express the behaviours. And so, as you said before about like tail movements, there's a heck of a lot of things that we do with the tail to show how they're feeling and communicate with each other. Even if not all of that is necessarily positive, you know, lots of it's sort of get lost type of actions, telling conspecifics that, you know, this is my mealworm, do one. You know, at least giving them the opportunity to think that through. That's just life, you know. People might say, oh, well, that's bad because it's not happy. But I mean, I've got a sister. When I was growing up, we would fight over food. We're still here now, right? And when I think back, that's childhood. That's what makes it. Would I want it any different? Would I rather be an only child because of that? Well, actually, I won't answer that question.
Let's hope your sister doesn't listen.
But you get the gist, don't you?
Yeah.
And again, I've got to be wary that none of all of what I'm saying is highly personified and not peer reviewed. But it's just I'm trying to drop these seeds of thought here that just because something seems at first, oh, that's a negative behavior. Well, is it? Is it really? Or is it just part of life?
Yeah.
And is stripping that away necessarily a good thing?
See, I've always been of when I first, not necessarily you, but when people started introducing the idea of Cohab, and I opened my Facebook back up and I was seeing more and more people doing it, and they were using the excuse to live in loose colonies to put them together. My firm belief was you're not giving them the space to perform as a loose colony. So in the wild, they obviously have multiple basking areas, but you set that up anyway, don't you? You have more than obviously the one line. You've got the UV and everything in. Do you have the same for your Leos? Because I know with your dragon, you've got multiple lights in the basking area, haven't you?
For all of the diurnal species, I either have or have more than, but certainly I recommend as the 4 minimum, a linear T5 lamp or T8, depending on the height of the enclosure and the UV requirements.
Yeah.
And that's going to take care of your UVB. Then also you're going to want a linear LED lamp to illuminate sort of the background, if you like. Even something like a Jungle Dawn LED bar, the intensity of visible light offered by such a lamp is low. You put it on in your living room and it lights it seems to give off loads of light, but that's only a product of the contrast. What your eyes, when you go outside, they sort of reduce the gain, if you like, camera terminology or whatever, so that things don't just look all overexposed. But because you're inside, if there's no additional lighting, that light source, which is not offering very intense visible light at all, looks really, really bright. So it really is just background illumination, those sorts of lamps. But then for the basking spot, if we're on about a diurnal species, I view it as essential that some dedicated source of quite intense visible light is offered. So for bearded dragons, lacertas, collared lizards, day geckos, they're the diurnal species I keep. They've all got either a metal halide or a spot LED, which is getting up to 20, 30,000 lux with a basking spot, which even for outside is only, not a very bright day at all, but it's significantly more than the few thousand lux, a couple of thousand that you'll get with a linear LED. And then additional to all of this, of course, is a halogen lamp, which is providing the near infrared. But that's sort of the basic basking rig. For the leopard geckos, I don't have the spot LED because, well, perhaps if provided with it, they would use it, but that is something that's got to be looked into yet.
Yeah, because the original point was I always tell people you're not giving them the space to do the loose colony thing, so they're going to have to. A lot of people will just have one specific spot, and I mean just so it's not a whole warm area, it's just a specific spot where they're going to have to compete for that heat, and they're going to have to compete for that UV and such. And I know UV's got a wider spread per se, but they're going to always go to that specific area. So that was always my main point against it. You keep throwing the argument loose colony, but where is the loose colony in that? They've got to come together regardless. That was always my standpoint on it. You bring all of them together, sort of thing.
Well, it's certainly I started off with my trio in a 3x2x2, or it was slightly less than that. It's one of the Viv Exotics with the weird dimensions.
Yeah.
And I thought on paper that should be enough, but sort of as time's gone on, it wasn't enough. I never found them squabbling over the basking side. That wasn't a thing. Not squabbling over a water bowl. The main problem is that when it came to feeding time, because it's only 3 foot width and they're all congregating at the front waiting to be passed something to eat, they inevitably end up standing on top of each other. And then when one's lunging for the food, one grabbing another by accident or just getting overexcited and nipping, it's going to happen. And it happened quite regularly. Now, they just sort of let go because You know, the one that's being nipped, they do a very rapid tail wag to tell the other to get off, and that's what they do. They get left alone. So there's no like crocodile rolling, taking arms off, or going for the jugular or anything like that. It's just accidental nips. And whilst it wasn't doing any serious damage, I didn't like it.
Yeah.
Because if I can avoid that happening, I would like to. And so that was the main issue with the size, really. And then the only sort of actual what I would consider antagonism, one animal purposefully going after another, was only between the females, and I only witnessed it a couple of times. But again, I think in a larger space, there is sort of room for one animal to just start off from the other. And with that being said, we have got to accept that animals are going to be animals, and they are going to have a pecking order. If you're going to cohab, you've got to sort of accept the fact that one animal's got to end up subordinate and one animal's going to end up dominant.
Yeah.
Now, then has got to come the point where, when do you step in? When is it that subordinate animals are pushed so far back that they need to be separated for their own well-being? Sort of an analogy I've sort of thought of is, if you have 50 acres and all of it is climatically controlled to match Islamabad or Nepal or somewhere in there, the leopard gecko's range, why would you only put one leopard gecko in that? You know, why would you deny it social interaction when they can get away from each other, completely away?
Yeah.
There's really, I don't see in such a situation that there is an argument for keeping them alone. You know, denying them the occasional social interaction they would have in that case is I don't see that as a good thing.
No.
And in an enclosure like that, you would have a small colony and they could spread out as they chose. Obviously, nobody's going to have an enclosure like that, but you sort of see the point that, okay, social interaction is something which, if facilitated properly, hasn't got to be seen as a bad thing. It's like, if you've pushed your care to the point where you can achieve cohabitation with the product being animals, which, to look at them physically, you couldn't see any marks, you could not tell whether they had been kept in a group or not, then instead of being something where we think, this is just for the owner, it's too hard to pull off, don't try it, you know, this is like that extra pinnacle of care where if you can get it right, then that is for the animal's benefit there, because that is the social interaction in terms of enrichment is second to none, you know.
So I'm guessing you've seen a lot of behavior changes with your initial solo Leo then, since being put into a group.
Well, I think that, again, this is all anecdotal, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt. I can't refute this with numbers, or, you know, back it up with numbers, whatever I'm trying to say. But they don't seem as shy in a group, and they definitely 100% learn from each other. I've seen it too many times to know that they definitely do learn from each other. The first instance I saw it was the females, which have been with each other for about a year and a half. About 2 weeks after I got them and they were in quarantine, one of the females randomly decided to crawl on my hand and crawl up my arm and come out the enclosure, which I thought, oh, that's nice. Just put her back and that was the end of that. But then the next day, the other female, who had hidden since I got her and hadn't been very bold, hadn't wanted to eat much, she had been watching the other female when she climbed up my hand, and the next day she did that.
See, that's the perfect example of adaptation, what you're saying there, like learning and adapting. Like maybe it's like when you see in dogs, you get that bold dog and then it suddenly pulls the shy dog out of its shell. That's what it sounds like to me, that Leo has adapted and thought, hold on, this isn't a threat here, this is a good thing. And I think that's where, going back to your intelligence thing, that's a point of, hang on a minute, that's intelligence in that animal to recognize this isn't a threat, because one Leo has showed it's not. So yeah.
And I was just blown away when that happened, because that was that was one of the first times when I twigged that, God, these little lizards aren't half clever. But then the thing is, the exact same thing happened again, because when I put the females in with the male hadn't learned that trick that he could just climb on my hand to get out the enclosure. but the females obviously had. And the male watched one of the females climb on my hand to get out, and immediately came from where he was and tried it and came out.
That's amazing. Like, this is what I mean, like, without somebody doing it right, this is the kind of things you'd never know as just a general keeper, because you're not given that opportunity to learn, because nobody else is really putting the funding and the time into it. Whereas, because you're obviously science-based as well, you're not just doing it for, as I've previously stated, money saving, you're doing it for the social interaction and benefiting your animals. I'd never have known the adaptation. I'd know of the adaptation of when they learn specific things and, like, ret training and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you wouldn't think, like, from a human perspective, interacting with humans, they're adapting to learn you're not a threat a lot faster than the patience it takes to keep putting your hand in for 5 minutes a day, removing it, coming back tomorrow and doing it that way. And that's fascinating to me, that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't expect it at all. I was utterly blown away when I saw it. And a third example of learning from each other, which isn't quite as concrete, because it would be quite possible for them to learn this individually, and it just so happened that they were in a group. But in any case, when I feed me leopard geckos, I put the crickets, mealworms, locusts, dubias, whatever they're on for the day, in a little cup with the vitamin powder in the bottom, and I shake it. And because there's hard-shelled insects shaking around in a cup, it makes like a little rattling noise, right? And the male had learned what that rattling noise meant. It meant that he was going to be fed. So he would rush out and come and expect me to pass him something. But the females hadn't learned that when they were in quarantine. They'd never picked up on it. But within not very long at all, maybe a fortnight of being in with the male, they were running out when they heard the noise.
Yeah.
Which, it's possible that they just learnt it separately, but I would be surprised if they hadn't picked up on the fact that, oh, he gets excited whenever there's this noise.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
Learn faster, being in the presence of him. Yeah. See, stuff like that is absolutely fascinating, because, as I said, you wouldn't necessarily ever know this type of stuff without somebody out there doing it. So it is absolutely amazing to hear and to learn about. We tried once with 3 females, didn't we?
Yes.
I find, because obviously there was no male in there, it wasn't intended as any sort of, you just wanted to dabble in the breed, and as you said, get it all out of the way now, so any mistakes you do make, it's nipped in the bud and you can learn from that. We did it as like a social thing, and there was the dominant one, but she was very dominant, and I mean, she wasn't just putting them in the place dominant, she'd purposely go out of her way to.
But it took over a year, though, for that to start happening, and that's why I just don't recommend cohabiting. I know you're doing it for your own purposes and stuff, and I'm not against people trying things like that, because I've tried it myself, like I said, because I like to look at the behaviours, of different reptiles, but it didn't work for me. And after watching them every day, because you probably do that yourself, you probably keep a close eye on them, and just to see how they're behaving, I just started to notice sort of cracks in the hierarchy in the group. And it started off, she was picking at one of the females in particular, but then it sort of, she started to move on to picking at the other female as well. And they had they had more than enough space. They had loads of hide. There was 3 mealworm dishes and 3 water dishes, all in different locations, because I know that's important. And when they had the other feeders, like the crickets or the locusts or anything like that, they'd have them spread out all across everywhere. They wouldn't just be in one location. But she was just very bolshy, weren't she?
Yeah, very.
It's interesting you say that, because it matches up with on the video I made about it. Lots of people got back with their experiences, and interestingly, it does seem to be the consensus that, well, obviously males don't get on, but females not getting on also seems to be quite common, especially when there's no male involved.
Yeah.
So again, as I said myself, the only antagonism I have seen in my group has been between the 2 females. The females snipping at each other. Now, the reason I think that might be Well, firstly, we might say that, okay, we've got enough space here, but again, jumping back to the hypothetical 50-acre plot of land, if you had that, that wouldn't be seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in an enclosure, in a living room or a house, it truly is never going to be enough space. You know, enough space is, you know, a quarter of Asia. That's enough space.
Yeah.
Like, you know, a whole subcontinent. That's how much room you need. But, you know,
I get what you're trying to say, because in the wild, they can just go wherever they want. So they're going to come across other females. They're going to come across like loose colonies and stuff like that. But in the wild, they don't really have to get as nasty in a sense, because there's just so much more room to, like,
if you even think of a dry stone wall in Pakistan, which might be housing leopard geckos, a dry stone wall might be how many feet long?
Yeah, that's true.
And how many different hidey holes are there in it? And this is going to have one colony of, I don't know how many leopard geckos, but the population density of those animals is going to be massively lower than it's ever going to be in an enclosure. And now what I was trying to think of before was people who keep fish. One sort of bit of common knowledge is that if you're going to try and pair up fish which are territorial, you want to get a male and a female. The best thing to have in some instances is to have one fish which is noticeably bigger and more dominant than the other, because that fish will then dominate. And once they've paired up, it's sort of the hierarchy's settled then. And I have a feeling that something, just an intuition, I don't know whether it's right, but perhaps that is a case in reptiles too, where if you've got a male which is noticeably bigger than the females, they're not going to bother scrapping because the position is secured. Why bother fighting with the member of the opposite sex, which you want in your group, when you're going to dominate the food time anyway because you're bigger, you know? But if they're both females and they're both pretty evenly matched, then it's who bites hardest wins.
Yeah.
You know?
I think you're right, because the only time females generally do fight with the opposite sex is when they're not ovulating. And that's if a male decides he wants to have his way, but she's not interested, so she will but even then, because I've witnessed obviously females rejecting males and stuff, even then there's not a huge fight. It's a sort of get off me or else kind of thing, and 9 times out of 10 the male just sort of walks off looking and feeling really sorry for himself, like, oh, I've just been rejected kind of thing. That's the only thing that I've witnessed myself. But like I said, I don't cohab. I did that experiment as an experiment because I like to look at the different aspects of keeping. And it was fine for over a year until suddenly it wasn't. And you find that quite often with leopard geckos if you try.
Yeah, I have heard that quite often.
Yeah, if you try and cohabit them, they can go for like a year or 2, or sometimes I've known people to say, 3 or 4 years. And then bang, all of a sudden, there's a huge tussle, one's seriously injured or worse, and then, it all ends in tears kind of thing. So because that female did eventually attack one of the others, I decided that was that sort of thing. I'd separate them as I do with all of my other ones. So obviously all of me males are separate and all of me females are separate. So yeah, they are housed in solitary. And because I'm not a huge breeder, I only do very selective pairings and stuff. I breed for what I can manage and what projects I want to go further with in that particular year. So they don't really, some females don't see a male for 2 or 3 years. It depends what I'm doing at the time. But they all do live separately. But as I said, I did that experiment and I did it because I've kept them for, it'll be about 18 years this year, Leo's anyway. Dragons is about 15. So because I felt like I had the experience behind me should a problem arise, I did do that a few years back, and I just did it for probably the same reasons as yourself, actually, just to see if it was feasible in in a specific environment. And obviously you've got a male in with yours. I didn't have that. I just wanted to see how females, work together if they did, which they didn't. And it didn't end well for me. And then I just advise most people not to cohabit. I mean, if you feel like you've got the experience and you want to experience it for yourself for, monitoring behavior purposes, then, that's up to the individual themselves. But for anyone that's just looking for a pet or, is new to breeding, I would always say, house separately.
Quick interval to tell you this week's codes are Herping 5 for 5% off all orders under £20 and Herping 10 for 10% off any orders over £20. That's Herping HERPINGPOD 5 or Herping 10.
Yeah. I would completely agree with you there. If somebody, let's not blur the lines here. Cohabiting is not an easy thing to get right. You need the experience. You need to know when it's time to call it quits. You need to have enough spare equipment that you can set up an animal quickly. And most importantly of all, I would say, is that you need to spend the time looking at your animal.
Yeah.
If you're going to be going away for months at a time, or you're planning on going on holiday or whatever and just leaving them in the house, well, what's going to happen if it does go wrong while you're away? Now, part of the reason, I suppose I'll get onto this, is I said the 3x2 by 2 foot enclosure I had them in wasn't big enough for the trio. So what I actually did was I had a pair of twin spot rat snakes, which I moved on, and that freed up 2 enclosures, each of them 3 foot long, 2 foot front to back, and 35 centimeters tall, so like 1 foot 2. And what I've done is I've stacked them one on top of the other and cut holes through. So there's 2 holes, so that I've got a lower layer and an upper layer.
That's cool.
Yeah. So the lower layer has just got a small LED in it just to let me see. And the upper layer's got the full basking rig. So basically it's like an above ground and a below ground section. I've not shown this on a video yet, but I can send some photos through.
It is, that's really cool.
I need to see this. That sounds so cool.
Is that what I did in some of the singular vivs with it? It wasn't in the Cohabit viv. It was in the other ones that I've got. The 2 layers. Well, I did 3 layers.
Yeah, you made your own with the backgrounds and stuff.
Yeah.
You put 2 vivs.
All right,
together.
cool.
That is cool.
I was going to say the idea of having the setup for the leopard geckos is sort of I've not filled the lower layer with substrate. I just want it as extra room to move. So it means that the leopard geckos can really get away from each other. They can effectively choose to be in a different setup. Obviously, they have to go up to basking. There's a water bowl on each layer. But it just means that when it comes to feeding time, I just choose to feed when one's on one side and the other 2 are on the other. So then they're not quite on top of each other the same. And additionally, it means that even though it's only a 3x2 foot footprint, they've effectively got 6x2 foot of floor space.
Yeah.
But they can still climb up the 70 centimeters of the full height. So it's sort of it makes a small volume equivalent to a very much larger enclosure. But the other thing that it leaves me with is a spare enclosure that's 3x2 by 2 foot, which is bioactive and fully set up with all the lighting. So when I go to university next, I'm going to move one of the females. So I've just got a male and a female together, which doesn't seem, that's not where the fighting happens or even just squabbling. That's not where that happens. It's between females. So at any one time going forwards, I'll probably just have a pair together and a separate female and sort of swap them around so that the females each have a turn, social interaction. But then again, when they are separate, they're able to recuperate from breeding efforts because obviously that does put a toll on them. So again, just giving them, having the space, B, the ability to separate, and even just giving them a break. I think adding all that together, that is sort of, if you're going to cohabit, I think these should be basic procedures really. And, the product being animals which are in good nick, because they're not scrapping with each other. If you've got two animals that are both in equally good nick, but one of them has been able to communicate with its own kind, has been breeding and so on, and the other one's just spent its whole life alone, then surely the one that's had that opportunity to interact with conspecifics, that is, instead of saying, oh, it takes too much effort, why would you go to all these efforts when you can just keep it alone? Well, if you're trying to push your care to that next level, that for me is something that shouldn't be looked down upon. It's something that, you should be aiming for.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people understand about the time, though, the time and the effort and the care that does go into it. A lot of people just think, throw them together, they'll be fine. They'll just turn into an animal like a dog, and it doesn't work like that. You do need the time to sit there and go, hold on, that's not a behaviour I like. I'll observe that and make sure it doesn't turn into anything sinister. You need to be able to observe that animal, and a lot of people don't have that time to put into it. They don't have the knowledge of the social signals. So, example, like going back to the tail rattling and stuff, like when a male obviously wants to have his way, he'll, like a rattlesnake, super fast, and he's like, and if she doesn't accept with her and lift her tail up and do her little slow wiggle sort of thing, then he's got no chance. Whereas it can look like she's saying no, because that's at the same time, that's when they see food, or they're trying to get it, they're thinking, do I have to drop this tail or whatever? They'll do the exact same tail wiggle. So, but there's subtle differences in each of them, whether it's the way it does actually bend or how fast it wags. And not a lot of people do see those subtle differences. So it does take a lot of the time and the effort and the know-how really. But how have you found you've had success doing it? What has been you can just turn around and pinpoint and just go, maybe that is what's caused this. And I'm guessing my personal opinion of it would be the male influence, because going back to the females being bolshy with each other, I'm going to say it's the male. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, well, again, the thing is I haven't been doing this for much time. So I've only had them as a trio for a year. But then before that, I had the females together as a pair in quarantine for 6 months. So again, because effectively 6 months, new setup for the females, then a year, new setup for the females, they've possibly just not had time to fall out yet.
Yeah.
For one to get territorial over the other. But I've really never seen, the only things I've seen a sort of aggression between the male and either of the females is, as you say, him wanting to mate and them having none of it. But my male in particular, he's a bit of a dopey sod, if I'm being honest. He's not as sharp as either of the girls. So when I've seen him sort of advancing and they don't want to know, they just coil round, give him that tail rattle, nip him on the side of the head, and then he just gives up. He's not very determined. But but this, I don't see that as a thing to say, oh, one's nipped the other, that means it's time to separate. I just see that as, that's just the way they say to get lost. That is part of the package when it comes to social interaction. There's the bits that they might enjoy more, and there's the bits that they might enjoy less. That's in the latter category, but it's all part of it. And if you can facilitate that, as I said, with the product being animals which are in perfect condition, then I think that is something to aim for, rather than to immediately get annoyed and go on a Facebook rant to say, why are you letting this happen?
What's the challenges you've had with it? What have you found most difficult? Because you mentioned 6-month quarantine. So obviously a lot of people kind of grind my gears. They don't quarantine their animals. They'll just throw them straight in. Even bringing them home, they don't really quarantine. So what's been your biggest challenge with the entire process, setting it up and getting it just so?
Well, the quarantine aspect is that wasn't too much of a trouble, because even before I moved the leopard geckos into the double layer setup, freeing up the other one that I've got, I already had spare equipment anyway. So setting up a quarantine enclosure and keeping them apart for 6 months was no bother. If you have got a collection of reptiles, then I would recommend definitely quarantining anyway. And 6 months, I would say, is a minimum period for quarantine. Maybe if you're getting these animals from a very good friend who you've known for a long time, and you've known they've had the animals for a long time, and you think, okay, you trust them, then okay, maybe you feel all right to bend the rules a bit and skip quarantine. But if you were going to be adding new animals within a group where they will have physical contact with an animal you've already got, then just damn well quarantine the things, because if you've got an animal and you add more animals and they bring in a disease, or your existing animals a hidden disease you don't know about and it passes it on to the new ones, well, that's your fault, really.
Yeah.
Just quarantine.
I've mentioned it on multiple podcasts. It is something I'm a stickler about, quarantine, and nobody seems to follow that. Like, the one thing I always wanted to say to someone when they came in the pet shop and they were buying something from us was, please don't put it on loose substrate. It's not this animal hasn't come from a breeder where you can guarantee its health. Now, other than the heating element, if it's in ill health, there is a chance it'll become impacted. And I've seen people coming in with reptiles, not eating with reptiles, sick, this, that, and the other. And it's like, you just want to tell them, but you can't. You've got to upsell. And I personally, myself, I don't agree with that, because I always want to say, look, you need to keep this animal sterile, as in something you can easily substrate, you can easily replace, like kitchen roll, something like that, where you can monitor that animal. Because whether you've got 1 Leo or 50, it doesn't matter. Health is equivalent to all, and if you have got 50, you're potentially wiping out an entire collection if it's something like crypto, and you're not quarantining it, and you're not using good hygiene practices. And yeah, that's something that really gets me, is the quarantine thing, because I do want to just, everyone should quarantine. You say, like, we usually go off the 3 month mark, separate 3 months there, we know everything, because we'll send off online fecals and stuff.
Yeah.
The pinworm count and everything. If everything's all right after 3 months, we'll move them into their own separate enclosure, monitor that way. But 6 months is a brilliant time, especially if you're planning on cohabbing, just to make sure there is nothing else that could be potentially passed on. But quarantine should always be practiced every time.
It annoys me when people don't do it.
Yeah.
It's such a simple thing.
I got ruined, or very nearly ruined, last year not quarantining, because I bought some baby lizards which were less than a week old and didn't quarantine them, because I thought there's no way something that young can bring a disease with it. Guess what? They had mites.
Yeah.
But I've got lucky, because I actually think they're specific to the species that I got.
Yeah. So
But if I'd have done that with a snake or something where the mites aren't so host specific,
yeah,
my whole collection by now would be riddled with them.
Yeah, and then obviously
and with all
and everything else, and
yeah,
that's a lot of tourist mites to buy.
Well, I'll tell you now, I spent 40 quid on tourist mites, and they didn't sort me out.
Did you know?
Oh no.
Let's not go there.
Let's not
Sounds
cry
like a bit of a
money
soft point, that one.
Oh no. I even quarantine my babies that hatch out here. Even though I know that I don't have anything here, I still quarantine them just in case. I have noticed that quarantining has gone out the window a bit, especially in recent years.
Yeah, well, I quarantine for the purpose when I've got any hatchlings and my cresties, because I don't breed. I like to work on projects for myself, and it's very rare I let one of my cresties go. But
yeah, why haven't you given me one yet, huh? Huh, Nick? Huh? Do I need to come over there and steal it?
I love them. I do. I love them. I love the way the reds are turning and stuff, because I want to do the opposite. You know, you see the cresties.
Are they still going up?
Yes, they're still up turning. So I'll have to get updated pictures.
Yes, you need to.
I quarantine my babies for the purpose of, even though I know they've not got mites or, parasites, do I know they're 100% full health to be putting them on substrate and everything else? They could be born with something genetic I don't know about.
Yeah.
Or congenital, that's the word. They could be born with a genetic or congenital issue and just, not be able to digest substrates like a healthy cresty and stuff. So yeah, I quarantine my babies for that purpose as well.
It's the same with the 4 gram minimum as well.
Yeah.
With the whole, we don't let them go until they're over the 4 gram because of making sure that they're healthy, making sure there's nothing wrong with them. And that
was another problem I had.
Yeah.
Was it?
One of the baby lizards I got wouldn't eat, and because it had that sort of issue. So I sort of did everything wrong with that batch of lizards, but learned from it, won't happen again.
Yeah, learn from it. As long as you learn from it, that's the biggest thing, isn't it?
The learning curve, innit?
As long as you're not making the same mistake over and over again, you're doing good. You're a good person if you're continuing to make sure you're doing things right. That's how I put it. If you're doing it intentionally and intentionally making mistakes, that's when we have to question and be like,
Sure, you should be keeping like.
I was going to say just about quarantining babies as well is, let's not forget that there is a possibility of passing mother to baby. Like I've been reading recently about adenovirus in bearded dragons can be passed from mother through egg to hatchling.
Yeah.
Now, if bearded dragons get adenovirus, it's a death knell.
Yeah.
It's either they'll manage to live and not show symptoms somehow, but the likelihood is it's not going to be a very nice ending. But that can pass from a mother dragon to a female without any physical contact between them. Just, so if you're gonna get a baby bearded dragon, firstly quarantine the bugger, and then secondly get it tested for adenovirus quick.
I'm going to assume that you wouldn't just recommend cohabbing to anyone, because you've mentioned previously it's not just a willy-nilly thing that you can just rush and jump straight into.
Well, definitely, if you're going to ask the general thing, if somebody's just listening to this podcast because they fancy getting another leopard gecko and they want to keep them together, I'm going to say don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't cohab. Just don't. If you're going to listen to nothing in this podcast at all, you're just going to drown out, and you've waited for the moment in the video where I'm going to give the final big reveal of whether you should or shouldn't cohab. Then I'm going to say to you, no. That if all you want to listen is to get that final answer, the answer is going to be no for you.
Yeah.
But if you've listened all the way through and you're continuing to listen and you are still paying attention to my irritating voice, firstly, well done. And secondly, I'm now going to say to you instead, if you don't have experience, if you don't have the time to sit and watch your animals on a regular basis, if you don't have the room for a very large enclosure, if you don't have the facilities to separate the animals at a moment's notice, don't cohab. But if you do have all of those things and you are willing to take on that responsibility, then the choice is up to you. Potentially there is something in it for the animals in social interaction, and potentially there's something in it for you, getting to watch them interact socially. So if you are willing to go with that, then I applaud you and I wish you success with it. But if you aren't going to do it properly, don't do it at all.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same. Just because I've done it myself and it failed. I know a lot of people who've tried it, and then I know a lot of people that I've tried to warn about it, and they've gone on to have the geckos that have fought and stuff like that. And so I would always say err on the side of caution, and if you've got the time to put into it behavior wise just to see if it can be done, then that's your prerogative kind of thing. Me personally, it's not something that I would do again.
It is an interesting point that you've said it, I've sort of witnessed it, and lots of people in the comments on the video I made about cohabbing, the ones that said they'd had fallouts were all between females.
Yeah.
So I would be very interested to know if you were to try a long-term male-female pair or multiple long-term male-female pairs, how that worked out. But referring to the wild situation, like Khan et al. Leopard geckos in Pakistan is a big one. Sort of the natural social structure is one or a couple of males plus a lot of females. It's not all females.
Yeah.
Putting them in an all-female group, it isn't a natural scenario. And again, by the time you then incorporate in the fact that there is always much less space than in the wild, and there's no opportunity for animals to run away from each other, maybe that is something we've got to think about, that it's not just will cohabbing work or won't cohabbing work, it's will cohabbing with this ratio work.
Yeah.
I guess, how do I put it? As long as we don't see them as animals with emotions and feelings, I think temperaments matter a lot as well. You've obviously got different temperaments, and if you've got a more placid one with one that's more highly strung, there's always going to be issues. So I think that plays a part in it as well.
Well, I was talking about this before. I suppose one thing I will say in a moment, because it's reminded me of it, it's just about leopard gecko breeding. I at least read somewhere, I don't know if you breed leopard geckos, you can maybe verify this, but leopard geckos are temperature sex determined, and lower temperature increases the probability of being a female. So like is it above 30 they're like guaranteed to be male, and below 28 guaranteed to be female or something?
Yeah, it's usually with females, it's the lower the temperatures, the more females you produce, the higher the temperatures, the more males you produce, and then the middling temperatures you can produce, either sex. But I usually have mine at 26 for females, and 31.5 for males. And then if you was to have it in the middle, I've added it about 28.5, for the middling.
And what I was going to say was, is I did read in one book on leopard geckos that females incubated at higher temperatures are more dominant, more aggressive, have larger heads and so on. They display more male characteristics than females incubated at lower temperatures, and likewise, higher temperature males are more masculine than lower temperature males. So even if you're not willing to personify lizards sufficiently to say that they'll have different personalities and temperament, well, in terms of masculinity, there's at least one thing I've read which would suggest that is true. If you've got lots of high temperature females in your group, then perhaps you're asking for more trouble than if you've got more low temperature females. All these things could be going on, and it all adds into the equation of, will cohabbing work for you or won't it?
Hot females are a very real thing, and they're a lot bigger, a lot broader, and they are a lot more temperamental. But there was it an infertile thing going around?
Yeah, they say that you can't breed hot females. Hot females are obviously females that have been incubated for male, and they've come out female. So usually you can still breed a hot female. It's just that because they've been produced from male temperatures, they take a lot longer to mature, with the ovulatory system. So within the third year is usually when they would accept a male, normally without aggression. They're not aggressive to humans or anything like that, but they're not very tolerant of other company. Usually your standard female would start ovulating around 9 months old. I've seen it earlier, actually, because one of my females started ovulating at 7 months old. I didn't obviously purr her at 7 months old, but it can happen earlier, than usual. But obviously with your higher temp females, they just won't be as accepting of males until around year 3 of life. So I'd say about 95% of them by year 3 would accept a male, but they just take longer to mature than other females. But I've never had a hot female that's been aggressive to humans or anything like that. They've all been perfectly fine. But there was one female that we had that, because you do still get the ones that still will not accept a male, but they're still quite good in nature as pets and stuff. So they're not very kind, let's just say. If you was to try and purr them and they still didn't want to, they would sort of attack like a male would attack, because they are more masculine. So you are right in what you're saying, in a sense that higher temp females definitely, they do look like actual males, because the heads are so broad and stuff like that. I think I've got 2 hot females in my collection. One of them actually did purr this season, and she's done really well, but she's very, very mellow. So although she was produced at higher temps, because I did purchase her off somebody as a male, she's surprisingly mellow, but she's definitely a hot female, because she would only purr this season. So I guess they've all got different, like you've said, they've all got different traits, different characteristics. And
that reminds me, actually, an interesting point I'll interject with, is that, again, talking about sort of physical biological differences in the behaviour of individual geckos, which can't be argued on the grounds of reptiles don't have personalities, which I disagree with. But again, going for things where it's inarguable, is morphs. If you're going to have a group and you're going to have 2 normals and an albino, well, that albino which can't see as well is at an obvious disadvantage to the others. And you can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
If you're into your morphs and you're going to start mixing morphs in a group, well, you know, I'm not into morphs, but certainly if you're going to try it, then you've got to have considerations about the sort of vitality of the individual animals and whether that's going to put some of them at risk of being bullied.
Yeah, well, I've got a gecko who if I put her in a naturalistic, she wouldn't survive. She's just not built for it, because obviously
you tried it, didn't you?
Yeah.
She was in one at first when we first got her, and
naturalistic fine, but then suddenly she dropped weight and everything. She just wouldn't feed, so I had to put her in a sterile quarantine. Again, she paid back up full weight, but she's Diablo Blanco, which means her eyes look black, but they're not. They're red. And she's all white. Now, this is where I question messing with genetics, because are we better in the animal, or are we doing it for our visual pleasure? So obviously, she can't survive in naturalistic or bioactive, anything like that. And I've obviously got that fear in me of she could become impacted because she can't see her food well enough to actually grab it. So she'll take mouthfuls off the floor 4, 5, 6 times before she actually manages to grab food, even if I've got them in tweezers in her face. So you also need to consider that aspect, because not only do you need to know what genetics you're putting together to not muddy lines, the bullying aspect, because she would in a group be picked off. No two ways about it. She won't be able to get food and stuff. She would be bullied because she isn't genetically strong enough to survive with the normals and the wild types and everything else like that, because they've not been messed with as much genetics wise.
And an interesting one, which I was going to get to this earlier, but just thinking about incubation and morphs reminded me, is that I think we were talking about this just immediately before the podcast, so I might have said it before, but I'll just repeat myself as I always do. Is that the females, as you might expect, having been with the male for a year and having all hibernated together, they were breeding this year, and I put a lay box in with moister soil and in the rest of the enclosure, and one of the females obliged me by always laying her eggs in that so I could collect them. And I did, and I tried incubating them multiple different ways, and every single egg went mouldy after sometimes getting on for a month. They sort of stayed all right and then just never developed. You know, I was candling them and nothing was happening. So maybe they were just infertile or whatever. But after I moved the adult leopard geckos to the new 2-tiered enclosure, like a day after, I spotted a tiny little baby leopard gecko in the adult sold enclosure. So it incubated purely in the setup, which I imagine mustn't be a very common thing to happen with leopard geckos, because they're so often they're so often in sterile setups, so they haven't got deep enough substrate or whatever. But I thought it was brilliant. But in any case, all of my leopard geckos, the adults, are max snows, apart from one which is a max snow hypo. I wanted to get all normals, but I couldn't find them, so I just got the nearest thing, which was max snows. And as it happens, what the odds I've had on this clutch have been unbelievable, because one of them is a max super snow, so that's like a quarter chance of getting that, and the other one is either a max super snow as well, or it's some other morph, because I don't recognise it properly. It's a whitey pink all over, apart from jet black eyes, and then black spots on the back, or like 2 big black splodges. So it's definitely, I wouldn't say it's a max super snow, but I think we were saying before it might be a max snow eclipse, but God knows. My adult stock are all from pet shops, so what hets they are, I don't have a clue. But anyway, I was just thinking that obviously I've had these 2 eggs incubate in situ, hatch in situ, and the babies are being raised in situ until they get to, you know, because that enclosure is that intricate and that I don't want to start pulling it apart because I might hurt one of the tiny little geckos. They're growing well, but I was just going to say I'm really interested to see how these babies develop, being kept together in a bioactive enclosure that they've been hatched in.
I was going to ask about that. Are you going to keep them in there and see how they get along? That was what I was going to ask you. Was you going to keep the babies in there and then just see how they develop from there, and their social hierarchy as well? Because a lot of breeders will separate.
But my plan is, I would like to move them to another enclosure, because they're sort of out in the garage, and they're gonna have to hibernate in like only a few months after they've hatched. If I don't move them, which I'm pretty sure they'd be fine with. I mean, they do it in the wild, and they just, when my adults or whatever, they never lose any weight when they hibernate. So I guess these would be the same. But in any case, I would quite like to move them into the house, keep them where it's warm, grow them up. But whatever I do, I'll be keeping them together until I'm going to give them to a friend in March. So they'll be with me for some months yet. And obviously it will be interesting to see again how babies do raise together.
So for anyone that's listened this far and still wants to go ahead, what is the best piece of advice you can give for cohabbing?
Space.
I'll agree with that.
That's it.
Yeah.
You know, as I said earlier, if you've got 50 acres and you're going to put a couple of leopard geckos in it, well, if you have that much space and you manage to have a problem with them, round of applause.
Is there any other species you was thinking of cohabbing and stuff?
I've actually cohab quite a few now. So I've got Dendrobates tinctorius and dying poison dart frogs. I've got a trio of them. I have 4 line day geckos together. The females do not get on in that species at all. The male's fine with the females, but the females don't get on between each other. I get away with it because the geckos are 3 inches long and they're in a 3 foot by 3 foot by 1.5 foot setup. But
ample space to get away then.
Yeah, my line is like that.
But ideally, if I hadn't sort of accidentally ended up with so many females, which is another story, I would only keep a 1.1 of those. I did have the Western green lizards cohabbed until I had a pair, and unfortunately I lost the male in a particularly sad incident, which I won't get into. But they were fine cohabbed. I've got a couple of collared lizards which live together, and they do fine. And I did try putting, when I had them, my twin spotted rat snakes a pair together, but they were only together for a fortnight because the male just constantly went after the female. So that wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, the collared lizards, Western green lizards, and dart frogs, perfectly fine cohabbed. No misgivings between them at all. It's only the female geckos of both species that I've cohabbed that don't like each other.
Maybe it's just a gecko thing then.
Maybe.
It definitely is. All my day geckos that I keep at the minute are all 1-to-1 because the females fight. That's literally the oh my god, yeah. Female geckos, not friends. So thank you for everyone that has been listening. We had an absolutely amazing time. We've had some really interesting topics of discussion spoken about today. So we hope that you take away some really interesting information from this one and maybe have a think about where you want to take your keeping in the future. So this has obviously been Leo Lowdown Part 3, Cohab Conundrum, with Joseph of JTB Reptiles. All links will be in the description down below. Make sure you check him out. He's got some awesome stuff on his channel, and we are super grateful that he decided that he would come on with us today. So we're really grateful. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, I have definitely enjoyed this one. I know.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
I do love the Leo ones. They're just exciting. Like, I just love like all the information, like, and everyone has such a different view on everything, and it's just good to like put it all together. So I like that we're doing it in parts. I'm living for this, even though I don't keep Leos, but I'm living for it. Okay, living for it. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day, evening, night, whenever you decide to watch this. If you're like me, 3 a.m. So we will see you on the next one. Also, make sure that you check out our amazing sponsor, Richard at Amphibipod. He makes some really cool 3D printed little stone hides, ledges, all sorts of cool things like that will make your enclosure really pop and stand out. So make sure you definitely check him out. His link will be in the description as well.
Thanks for joining us, Joseph. It's been very informative, and I've learned a lot myself from your experiences, Leo, keeping in a cohab. So thank you again for joining us.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed being on, and hopefully you'll be on sometime in the future.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
For sure.
Cool.
Bye for now, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.